Hi, my name's Rhiannon Jenkins. I'm a buyer's agent at Buyer's Domain, and I'm joined by Jodie Dang, Principal of Jodie Dang Architects. And we are going to chat about all things development applications, in particular in the Inner West Council. We've had a couple of questions come through, and when I work with buyers, there seem to be some recurring questions that a specialist architect could answer for them. So we are going to talk in general terms, of course, so it is going to vary case by case, and you need to get your own specialist advice. But we wanted to tackle some of these frequently asked questions. So welcome, Jodie.
Hi, Rhiannon. Thanks for having me.
So if we jump straight in, could you tell us the difference between a development application, what's known as a DA, and a construction certificate?
Okay, so a development application is the application to council to get your works approved before construction. So majority of alteration additions or new builds in the Inner West, you'll need to do a development application to council. So after you get your approval, you go into the construction certificate stage. So you actually need an extra set of approvals before you can actually start constructing.
Mm-hmm.
The major difference between a DA and a construction certificate is that the construction certificate is usually can be done by a private certifier, and they include a lot more documentation than your DA. So in your construction certificate, you will usually also have your engineer's drawings and your hydraulic and stormwater drawings in detail to get your construction certificate.
Okay, so the DA, I understand, is sort of the initial phase to understand if your works fit inside of the legislation parameters. And then when you get to construction phase, it's then getting all of the details, so around the building specifications and any of those requirements, and making sure all of those detailed elements are ticked off. And then does that need to be resubmitted back to council? And then that construction certificate needs to marry up with the DA? Is that the process you would go through?
That's correct. So basically, the DA is works that comply with the development control plan that is approved by council. The construction certificate that can be approved by council as well if you choose to get that approved by council, or you could go with a private certifier. And usually clients would prefer to go with private certifier, mainly for various reasons. Sometimes they just know someone that the architect has worked with before and they have a good rapport with them, and they know the response rate is quite fast.
Okay. And what's
construction.
Go ahead.
There's a construction certificate. The drawings in your construction certificate would then start referencing things like Constructed Building Code Australia, to the building codes, the Australian standards, and also incorporates all your structural engineering detailings and your hydraulics details as well into your architectural set.
Okay. And what would be the benefit of having an architect on board when you're going through this process?
Oh, so an architect, they're able to they're able to coordinate all the different consultants required. And also they understand all the building codes and Australian standards. And at the same time, they hold liability to the works done. So if anything is done incorrectly or not to, or they pick up something on site, then the architect is liable to address the issue and resolve it. So if you don't have an architect assisting you with your project, then the liability is down to the homeowner to understand all the different codes and compliances, and if anything is not to code or is done incorrectly, it's back on the owner to rectify the works.
Okay, fantastic. And can you tell us about the timeline of DAs? So how long can you have a DA for? How long does that last? And say if you do commence works, but you don't finish your works, how long do you have to complete those works? What are the timelines and parameters you need to work with when you do obtain a DA?
Okay, so with the Inner West Council, after you get DA consent, you usually have a period of 5 years to start the works. So once you get your construction certificate and you've contracted a builder and the work starts on site, that construction certificate time period is infinite. So you don't have a strict time period to complete your works.
Okay.
However, if you don't get a construction certificate within the 5 years of your DA consent, your DA lapse. Once the DA lapse, you will need to reapply to council to get your DA consent again.
Okay. So what about off-street parking? So if I want to apply to get off-street parking as a part of my property and apply for that process, how do I know? So if I'm going through the purchasing process, how do I know what the likelihood is of obtaining approval for off-street parking, and what's the process that I would need to go through?
So every council will be different, and they have different rules for off-street parking. And the best way to find out about off-street parking is really to contact council directly. So you'll need to make an appointment with the duty planner. And this is a free service that is offered by council. And usually when you're buying, you will have a 10.7 certificate. You take your 10.7 certificate to council, and then in your appointment with your duty planner, they would advise you about the off-street parking.
Okay, great. So for the Inner West Council, for example, so I could go on their website and find the contact number for the duty planner, or if not, just the general number, perhaps. Call the council and explain what you're trying to do to see if there's an approval process, and then just book in a time. And is the timeline and turnaround quite quickly when you do contact the council to speak with the duty planner, or does that take weeks or months to go through?
To get a duty planner to speak to you, it should be like a 1 or 2 day process. They'll timeline you in, and a duty planner will give you a call. And depending on how complicated or how easy that process is, it could really just be filling out a form, or it could be something a little bit more, harder. Then the duty planner would advise you on the timeframes.
Okay,
But
excellent.
Inner West Council is pretty responsive. So you're in pretty good hands with Inner West Council when you speak to the duty planner.
Okay, that's good to know. And finally, last question for you, Jodie. How do I know when my renovations would trigger the requirement to apply for a development application?
That's a very, very good question. It will actually come down to your 10.7 certificate. So your 10.7 certificate would advise you of all the different planning codes and regulations associated to your site. And it will also advise you if your site could go for compliant development certificate, exempted compliant development certificate, or all works needs to be approved by council and going for the DA route. If you're unsure on how to read this 10.7 certificate, the best course of action is speak to your duty planner. Call up council and just have a 10-minute chat with them and tell them what works you want to get done, and they would advise you if you need council approval or not.
Okay, fantastic. So there's a little bit of a different sort of process depending if it's complying, if it's exempt, or if you need that DA. Could you briefly explain the differences between those categories for us?
So DA means that usually if you're in a heritage conservation zone or you're heritage listed, then you will really need council consent before you could do any works internally and externally. Some things that falls under exempt and compliant development, these are things like kitchen refurbishments, bathroom refurbishments that you could just do with yourself and the builder and with an architect or interior designer, and doesn't need to go into council for approval. However, with the Inner West, majority of the time, when you want to move an external wall or window, you will most likely need council approval. And that's when you should really speak to the duty planner or an architect before you start any works.
Okay, thanks for the tips, Jodie. And it's good to know. Look, if anybody has any questions about it, it is a very specialist area. So it's really important to speak with an architect, or if you don't have an architect on board, reach out to council and really understand the requirements for any renovations or anything that you might be factoring in while you're going through considerations for purchasing or renovating your property itself.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks for your time, Jodie.
Thank you.